Alright, so here we are in Chapter 3. We're starting Chapter 3. We're going to talk about the rectangular coordinate system. We're going to talk about it in Chapter 3, all of Chapter 3, and then Chapter 4 we're going to kind of use it a little bit as well. And we'll continue to use Chapter 3. In fact, the graphing is going to be used quite a bit when we're in kind of analyzing some data. And we'll use graphing quite a bit as well in Math 141, the intermediate algebra. So, our section here is 3.1. We're going to talk about the rectangular coordinate system. We're going to talk about interpreting graphs. We're going to talk about plotting points in a rectangular coordinate system. And then we're going to talk about maybe some applications of plotting and identifying points. So if you see right down here, table 3.1 is a table of information. Sometimes, though, it can be helpful to look at information and kind of get some data out of it by looking at a graphical representation. That'll help us get more information out of the data. Sometimes we can look at the data right away in a table and kind of get some information. Sometimes it's easier to look at a graph. And that's why it's important to kind of be able to know how to set up a graph and also how to get some information from a graph to a table, because that's going to be doing that, pulling information out of a graph into a table, or vice versa, from a table into a graph, will help us analyze some of the data, especially in Math 141, like I mentioned. So we can maybe take a look at some of this information that's in the table and in the graph, and kind of look at what is easier to look at. So here's a couple questions. If we're looking at a graph, and we're looking really at the data, we've got to interpret that data sometimes. So if we're interpreting the data, then we've got to look at either the table or the graph, and sometimes it's easier to find the information from the table or the graph. So let's take a look at the information on the previous page and say, for which month was the number of clients the greatest? So we'll go back to the table. We'll go back to the information. For what month was the number of clients the greatest? Is it easier to find the information in the table or in the graph? To be honest with you, you could probably go through here and say, number of clients, was it the greatest? Well, what was the greatest? Here's 60s, here's now 70s, here's now 80s, here's now 74, here's 85, and here's 90. Wow, that's the largest number of clients. But if you go over to the table, you could say, well, what's the largest number of clients? Well, here's the number of clients. When is this line the highest in the graph? Right there is the highest point. So you could say that right there, that's my highest point. And the question was, for what month was the number of clients the greatest? All right, well, the month was right here, number 12, so it was December. So it's not asking what was the number, it's just asking for what month. So right there is my data point that's the highest, and sure enough, that's the month, 12. So that's, in my mind, I think it's probably easier to look at the graph here and say that's the easier way to look at that information. Question number 2, or I guess a different question might be, how many clients were served? Hang on a second. How many clients were served in the first month in January? Let's go back to the information. Well, we can go to the table here. Sorry, we can go to the graph. Let's see, how many clients were served in the first month? Well, here's our first month. Corresponds to, let's see, here's 50, because here's 40, here's 60, halfway between is 50. Is it 54, 55, somewhere in that range? And it's really not that specific, because the scale on this axis here is pretty big. So right here is the question we're talking about, the point we're talking about, and then what's the value, I guess? Well, you'd have to go back to the table, I suppose, and say that would be probably an easier way to go and find the information. Sure enough, it'd be 55, because here's 50, right halfway between 40 and 60 would be 50, and then halfway between there is 55, and you'd be hard-pressed to really get any more information than about 55. But if you go over to the table, you can say, sure enough, from the table, in the first month, we had 55 clients. So just a kind of example of, getting information from either the table of information or the graph of information to find out or to get more information quicker. So these other questions as well can give us more information about what type of, or I guess where we can find information easier. Which month corresponds to 60 clients served? Well, let's see, if we go to 60 clients served, here's 60. Well, let's see, we'd have to find, here's our 60 clients served. Would the information be better found here? Maybe not, because here's our 60 line. Was it that one or that one or that one? Our line is kind of crooked a little bit. so this graph might not be the best, so you'd have to go over here, probably the table, and say, oh, 60 clients served, that was month number 4, April, sure enough. So you can kind of see that information in a table and in a graph can be found, or I guess information can be found easier for some questions from the table, easier for some questions from the graph. So that's kind of what we're talking about right here. So I'm going to leave it at that, and we're going to start up a new slide and a new presentation for this information.